The broke rancher sold his only horse for $20 to buy her off the block. The morning I sold Cutter, the sky was the color of old iron and there wasn't a cloud in it. Clear and cold and empty, just like my bank account and about half my good sense. I stood in the yard with my hand on his neck, that big sorrel neck, warm even in the November bite, and Harlan Pruitt was already counting out the bills, folding them one at a time like he was doing me a favor, which I suppose he was. $20 was $20 when you had nothing. Cutter turned his head and looked at me, not with any reproach, just looking. Horses do that. They hold still and they look at you and they don't say a word, and somehow that's worse than anything they could say. I had owned that horse 9 years. I had bought him as a 4-year-old from a man named Vasquez who was going north to Colorado and couldn't take him, and Cutter had been a little uncertain at the edge of things back then, a little wild, and we had worked that out together over the first winter until he was the best horse I'd ever put a saddle on, sure-footed in the dark, calm in bad weather. He'd pulled me out of an arroyo once after a flash flood that came from nowhere, water moving faster than it had any right to move, and I had never fully repaid that debt. Now I was selling him for $20 to Harlan Pruitt, who needed something to pull a plow. "He'll be good to you," I told Harlan. Harlan shrugged and handed me the money. He didn't care about good. He cared about whether the animal could pull a plow another season, and Cutter could. Cutter could pull till Judgment Day and never complain about it. That was one thing we had in common. I watched him lead that horse out of my yard, and I didn't move until the dust settled. The sound of hooves on hard ground going away is a particular sound. I'd heard a lot of things go away, people, mostly, and they each have their own register of absence. Cutter's was the sound of the last solid thing. Then I folded the $20 and put it in my shirt pocket and walked back inside and sat down at the kitchen table. That table, 32 years old, and I'd been sitting at it since I was 8. My father built it out of pine he'd hauled from the mill in Benson, and it had a long crack running across the center where it had dried out one bad summer, and my mother had filled the crack with candle wax and told my father it was a conversation piece. He said something about the conversation being short. She laughed and he laughed, and I remember thinking that was the whole world, the two of them laughing at that table. I don't know why I remember the specific pitch of that laughter. I don't know why that's the thing that stayed out of everything from that time. Now it was just me and the crack in the pine and $20. The ranch was 412 acres, which sounds like a lot until you understand that roughly 200 of it was caliche hardpan where nothing grew except scrub and disappointment. The rest could be worked, had been worked, and would need to be worked again come spring, which was the problem. I had no seed money. I had no working capital. I had sold the last of my steers in September to cover the land tax, sold my spare saddle in October to cover the feed I owed Mitch Albright at the supply store, and now I had sold Cutter to cover I didn't even know what. The feeling of not being completely swallowed yet, maybe. The feeling that $20 was still something. My name is Cal Reyes. My grandfather came up from Sonora when this territory was still Mexico, and my father was born here and I was born here, and I had never in my life lived anywhere else, and I did not want to. But wanting and having are two separate conversations, and the land doesn't care which one you're having. I had watched the land take my father by inches, not his body, but his spirit, the slow erosion that happens when the thing you've built keeps asking more than you have to give. He died at 59 believing he'd failed it. He hadn't failed it. The land just wanted what the land always wants, which is everything, and a man can only give most of it, and that has to be enough. I was 32, and I was giving most of it, and I was running out of most. I sat at the table for a while, looking at the crack. Then I got up and went to hitch the mule. The first Tuesday in November, 1887, I rode into Dellard on Pete Sandoval's borrowed mule to buy flour and salt and what coffee I could afford, which turned out to be less coffee than I'd hoped. Dellard was a small town. 2 streets that crossed each other. a water tower, a saloon that did better business than the church, and on the far end of the main street, a wide flat area they used for loading cattle, and occasionally for what Dellard people called an auction. The word auction can mean a lot of things. I heard the noise before I saw it. Not a big noise, not a crowd or a celebration, more the kind of low sound a group of men make when they're watching something that makes them feel powerful. There's a particular quality to that sound. It sits lower than other crowd noise, and it moves differently, like it's happening slightly below the normal register of things. I'd caught the edge of it once when I was 11, when my father and I had rounded a corner somewhere, and he'd heard it and put his hand on my arm and turned us around without a word. I'd been old enough to register it and young enough to not understand it, and he'd never explained it to me afterward, and the question had stayed with me. I tied the mule at Albright's rail and went toward the sound instead of away from it. There were maybe 20 men in a loose half-circle at the flat area. A man I didn't know was up on a dry goods crate that somebody had stood on its end to make a platform, and he had the bearing of a man who sells livestock, a practiced confidence, a showman's ease. He was talking. As I got close enough to hear him, I started to understand the words. And the words were doing exactly what that kind of man's words do when he wants other men to feel they're getting something they'd be foolish to let pass. Then I got close enough to see what was on the platform. There was a woman standing there. She was standing straight. I'll say that first because it matters. Whatever else was happening, she was standing straight and her chin was level, and her eyes were moving over the men in that half-circle with an expression I can only describe as withering contempt. Not performing courage, she just had it, the way some people have a particular color in their eyes, a thing that's just part of what they are. She was Apache, or partly. High cheekbones, dark braided hair, a wool blanket over her shoulders that she held closed at the throat with one fist. A bead at the end of her braid caught the flat November light. The man on the crate said, $18 from Mr. Caswell. Do I hear 20? Something happened in my chest, not a noble thing, not a clear thought about right and wrong. Just a hard, physical response, like a fist closing around something I hadn't known was still inside me. I pushed to the front. The auctioneer looked at me with the expression of a man whose business has been interrupted. Sir, you'll have to. How much? I said. He blinked. I beg your pardon. How much to close it? The woman's eyes moved to me. Black eyes, very still. She looked at me the way Cutter had looked at me that morning, holding still and looking and saying nothing. Last bid was 18, the auctioneer said, after a pause in which he seemed to decide whether to engage with me. I reached into my shirt pocket and put the 20 on the crate beside his boot. 20, I said. Done. There was murmuring in the half-circle. A man to my left, big man, thick hands, the kind of man who usually gets what he wants in small towns, took a step forward and started to say something. I looked at him. Not a threat, not performing anything. Just looked at him steady. He stopped. The auctioneer picked up the 20 and looked at it. He looked at me. He looked at the woman who was still looking at me. Sold, he said. He said it the way you say a word when you've decided you want no more part of what you're saying it about. I want to be honest about what I was thinking, because I am not an impulsive man. I had spent 32 years being careful and practical and deliberate, and one of those careful, deliberate things had been selling my horse that morning for $20, and now the $20 was gone, and I was standing in the middle of Dellard, next to a woman I had just bought with the last money I had in the world. What was I thinking? I was thinking about my father's hand on my arm, and the direction he'd walked me, and the thing he'd never explained. I was thinking about Cutter's eyes looking at me in the yard. I was thinking about the set of this woman's chin. I was not, in any practical sense, thinking at all. That was the truth of it. Some things you do with your thinking mind, and some things you do with the other part, the part that's older and quieter and doesn't explain itself. My father had an old word for it in Spanish that translates roughly as conscience, but lands closer to the part of you that knows what you're for. I had mostly kept it quiet over the years, kept it manageable, and it had let me. It had been quiet when I sold the steers and quiet when I sold the saddle and quiet that morning in the yard watching Cutter go. But it was not quiet when I heard that sound from the flat area and walked toward it instead of away. It was done being quiet. I stepped back from the platform and waited. She climbed down from the crate herself, no waiting for assistance, no searching for a hand, and she walked to where I was standing and stopped 2 feet from me and looked at my face. Not searching it, more like reading a bill of sale to check whether the numbers were right. "You speak English?" I said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was low and level, no accent I could immediately place. "I don't have a horse," I said. "I've got a borrowed mule. I'm sorry about that." She looked at the mule, which was at Albright's rail minding its own business. "Where do you live?" she said. 8 miles south. Small ranch, it's not much." She looked at the mule again, as if reconsidering the 8 miles. "What's your name?" I said. She was quiet a moment. "Knocklin," she said. Then translating, "People call me Nina." "Calrays," I said. "That's my name." We stood there. Some of the men in the half-circle were still watching, from a distance now. The auctioneer had climbed off his crate and was talking to someone else and not looking at us. "You going to tell me to go?" she said. "No," I said. "I'm going to ask if you want to come." She looked at the mule a third time. 8 miles, she said. 8 miles, I confirmed. She walked to the mule and put her hand flat on its nose, and it didn't shy. The mule liked her immediately. I noted that. "All right," she said. I went inside Albright's and got my flour and my salt, and my short ration of coffee. Mitch Albright watched me come back to the counter and watched Nina waiting outside and said absolutely nothing, which was the most generous thing Mitch Albright had ever done for me, and I made note of it. I loaded the saddlebag and we walked out of Dellard, the mule between us, and I didn't look back. The 8 miles were quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, the sound of boots on hardpack, the mule's breathing, once a crow off to the left in a stand of dead mesquite. The sky had softened to flat white by mid-afternoon. It was going to be cold that night. She walked like she'd walked long distances before, an easy stride with nothing wasted in it. Around the 4th mile she said, "Why?" I knew what she meant. I thought about it for a good 100 yards. "My father walked me away from something once," I said. "When I was 11, I don't think he meant to leave me with a question about it, but he did." She didn't say anything. "I've been carrying the question a long time," I said. Another 100 yards. "That's not a complete answer," she said. "No," I agreed, "but it's the honest one." She accepted that. We walked. When the ranch came into sight, the low adobe walls, the outbuildings, the bare cottonwoods along the dry creek, I saw it the way she must be seeing it. Small, worn, the fence on the east side listing, the barn roof showing 2 dark patches where it had needed work for 3 years and hadn't gotten it. "It's not much," I said. "You said that already," she said. Seemed worth repeating. She looked at it the way you look at ground you might plant, not with disappointment or approval, with assessment. "The house," she said, "is there a stove?" "Yes." "Does it work?" "It works." She nodded once and walked toward the house. That first night I made a fire and she made the coffee. She made it right, which is to say strong, and we sat at the cracked pine table. She told me a little of how she'd come to be in Dellard. Not much, and I didn't push. She had a sister somewhere. She'd been traveling to her sister when she was taken. Men who move people like livestock. She said it in the flat voice of someone describing a weather system. It happened. She'd been in Dellard 2 days. "I had $6 in my boot when they took me," she said. "They didn't find it." She put the $6 on the table between us. I looked at it, looked at her. What are you doing? I said. I'm not a charity case, she said. I'm not a possession. I'm a person with $6 who needs to get to her sister. Where is your sister? Bisbee, or she was. The last letter I got was Bisbee. Bisbee was 90 miles southwest, rough country. In the winter, I said. People travel in winter. Not alone, not a woman alone in that country. I've been alone before. I don't doubt it, I looked at her across the table. I'm asking you to stay until spring, that's all, your own room. You go to your sister in March when the passes are clear. I'll drive you myself. She looked at me with those black eyes. What do you want in return? Help, I said. This place is failing. I've got a busted irrigation line and a barn roof that leaks and 60 acres that need turning come spring, and I'm doing it alone because I can't afford to hire anybody. I need a second pair of hands. That's the exchange. She looked at the table, at the crack my mother had filled with candle wax. She reached out and ran her finger along it slowly, like she was reading something in it. Spring, she said. Spring, I said. And then you drive me. And then I drive you. She picked up the $6 and put them back in her boot, not taking the charity, keeping what was hers and doing something else instead. Show me the irrigation line, she said. I have to tell you about the 4 months because the 4 months are the whole story. Not the auction, not the $20, not the dramatic moments. Those are just instants. The 4 months are what it actually was. The irrigation line was a clay tile system my father had laid in the early 70s, and it had cracked in 2 places where the ground shifted. I showed Nina the crack I knew about, the one I'd found in September when the water pressure ran short on the east field. She looked at it and listened while I told her what I'd planned, dig it up and reline with fresh tile, and she didn't say anything, just started walking the rest of the line. She found the second crack herself, same day, an hour later, just by walking and listening. She moved slowly with her head slightly down, and her eyes not quite fixed on anything visible, some internal attention I didn't have a name for. And then she stopped and crouched and put her hand flat on the ground without saying anything for a moment. Then she said, "Here." I crouched beside her. There was nothing to see, just bare ground. "How?" I said. "Water talks through the ground," she said. "You can hear it if you're quiet enough." She pressed her palm flat on the earth, and I did the same, and I couldn't hear anything. But after a few seconds I felt something. A faint vibration, almost not there, the kind of thing that could be your own pulse if you didn't know what you were looking for. "I'll take your word for it," I said. "You'll learn it," she said, standing up. "A season or 2. She directed the repair and I provided the labor, and we got both cracks fixed in 4 days. Cold days, ground still half frozen, the kind of work that leaves your hands numb by noon and your back talking at you by evening. We came in at the end of each day with clay on our clothes and the smell of cold earth and everything, and I made coffee while she washed up at the basin, and we sat at the table without saying much because we were too tired for much, and that was its own kind of comfort. The quiet of 2 people who'd worked alongside each other until there was nothing left to prove. The barn roof she studied from the outside before she said anything. She walked all the way around the barn first, looking up at it from different angles, which I'll admit I hadn't done. I just looked at the dark patches from inside and known I needed to get up there. She stood at the far corner and looked for a long time. She said there was a way to patch it that would hold 2 seasons, and a way to do it right the first time. She asked which I wanted. I said, "Which is cheaper?" She said, "The 2-season patch." I said, "Then we do it right the first time." She gave me the look, that bill of sale reading, numbers being checked against something. Then she said, "You'll need to get on the roof." I said, "I know." She said, "You looked at that roof for a while before you looked at anything else when we pulled up." I said, "That is not a fair characterization." She said, "I think it is a fair characterization." I said, let's go get the materials. I want to be clear that I'm not afraid of heights in any general sense. I'm cautious about specific heights in specific situations, and the barn roof was one of those, not because of how high it was, but because the old boards were dry and uncertain, and I had been alone on this place for going on 3 years. And when you're alone, you develop a sharp awareness of what the consequence of any given mistake looks like. Nobody was coming to find me. Nina went up first, just climbed easy and sure like elevation was nothing, and sat at the peak looking down at me. I climbed up. 3 days on the roof. I will not pretend it was entirely comfortable. There is a thing a man does when something bothers him but needs doing, which is to do it slowly and deliberately, and not look down more than the work requires. Nina worked beside me, not assisting, working, her side of the job advancing at the same pace as mine, and she never once mentioned the height or how I was handling it, which was a grace I didn't acknowledge at the time but remember now. On the 3rd day we climbed down and stood back and looked at the patched roof in the last of the afternoon light, and it was solid. You could see it was solid the way you can see when something has been done right versus done adequately. The two things looked different. She put her hands on her hips and looked at it. Good, she said, just the one word. I don't know entirely why that word landed the way it did. I'd received the assessments of practical people about practical work my whole life, and something about the economy of it. The single word, no flourish, no explanation, just the plain statement of what was true, felt more complete than most things I'd been told in years. Like a sum coming out even. The cooking she did more than half of, not because I couldn't but because she was better at it, which is a fact, and I don't resent facts. She knew what the desert would offer even in November and December, what could be found if you walked the right places with the right attention. She made a soup one night from what I would have described as close to nothing. A few things she'd gathered, dried roots she'd found or traded for somewhere, the last of the salt, a heel of old ham I'd forgotten about at the back of a shelf, and it was the best thing I'd eaten in longer than I could honestly recall. I told her so. She said, your mother cooked well. I said she did. She used to fill this table. Nina looked at the table, at the crack. She said, it's a good table. We sat with that, the stove going, the lamp low, the night quiet outside. December came in cold and stayed. The creek froze solid in the 2nd week, which it didn't always do, and I had to break the ice every morning for the mule. Nina started doing it before I was up. I'd come out in the dark before sunrise and the ice would be already broken and the mule already watered, and she'd be standing at the corner of the barn, the axe handle hanging from one hand, watching the sky begin to change. Not doing anything, just watching the light come. You don't have to do that, I said one morning. I know, she said. I'm usually up by then. It was 4:30, she said. I didn't have a response. The nights were long and both of us were sometimes up late, which is what happens in winter when you're not exhausted by the day's work, and there are more hours than there are things to fill them. I sat with my accounts one night, the ledger that was mostly red, numbers that didn't come out right no matter how you arranged them, and Nina sat at the other end of the table, mending a blanket with needle and thread she'd found in a drawer. We didn't talk much. The stove went, and the lamp went, and outside the wind came off the flats and moved around the corners of the house with a sound that was mostly just present, not threatening, just the night being what it was. Another night she asked me about the brands on the back wall of the barn, the old irons my grandfather had brought up from Sonora, the marks his family had used down there for 3 generations. I explained them to her and she listened. And then she told me about the symbols her people used to mark their horses, the way ownership and lineage were recorded in marks on an animal's hide, different from what white ranchers did but not entirely different either. The idea of belonging to a place, of a family's mark on things. We talked for probably an hour about that, which was more than I'd talked at once in longer than I could remember. I started to understand something about her in those December nights. She was a woman who thought before she spoke, who never said a thing simply to fill air, and so when she did say something you could trust that it had been worth saying to her before she said it. That's a rare quality. I had known only two other people who had it, my father, and the pastor at the church my mother used to attend, a quiet man who said little and meant all of it. Nina had it more completely than either of them. My mother used to talk about the house having a character at night, a personality that only came out after dark when things got quiet. I thought that was her way of talking. Sitting at that table in December, I understood it better. The house had held a lot of years, a lot of people, and it remembered them somehow, in the way old wood holds the shape of the hands that worked it. And now there were two people in it again after 3 years of one, and the house seemed to know the difference. One night a rider came. Past 10, which is the hour when nobody comes to a ranch at good intent. I heard the horse in the yard and came to the front room with my rifle, and Nina was already there. Not from her bedroom, she'd been in the chair by the stove in the dark, a blanket on her shoulders. I didn't ask about it. There are nights like that. The rider was the big man from Dellard, the one with the thick hands. He called out from the dark, and I stood in the doorway with the rifle at an angle that wasn't quite pointed but could be in a breath, and he said he'd come to make me an offer. He said he'd give me $25 for what was mine. I said, "Nothing here is for sale." He said he wasn't talking about the ranch. I said, "I heard you the first time. Nothing here is for sale." He sat on his horse in the dark, and I could feel him deciding whether I was the kind of man who meant what he said. The rifle was easy in my hands. The cold was fine. I could stand in this doorway as long as needed, and I had no intention of needing anything else. He turned his horse and rode out. I stood until the sound of hooves was completely gone. Then I turned around and Nina was standing just inside the doorway, close enough that I could see her face in the dark. She'd heard all of it. She looked at me for a long moment. "He'll come back," she said. "Maybe." "Probably. That kind usually does." "I know that kind," I said. She looked at the rifle and then at me. "You weren't afraid of him," she said, not quite a question. "No," I said. "There's enough real things to be afraid of. A man like that isn't one of them." Something moved in her expression. Not a smile. Nina didn't smile easily. I was learning, but some small change in the set of her face, a slight shift in whatever she was deciding about me. I couldn't have named it at the time. Later I would call it trust, but right then I just registered it as a change and put it away to look at later. She went back to her chair by the stove. I went back to my room. January was the hardest month. It usually is in this country at this altitude. The cold was serious, and the supplies needed watching, and I woke up one morning in the second week of January with a fever coming in, and tried to ignore it with the usual results, which is to say I was not standing straight by afternoon, and by evening I was on the kitchen floor. I am not a man who gets sick easily. I am also not a man who handles it with any particular dignity when I do. I was going to go to my bed, which was 9 feet from where I was standing. What happened instead was that I sat down on the kitchen floor and couldn't quite work out how to continue from there. The floor is clay and flagstone, very cold in January. I sat on it and looked at the underside of the table my father built and thought about the various decisions that had led to this particular position. Nina came in from outside and stopped in the doorway and said something in Apache that from the tone could have been a prayer or an opinion. And then she said in English, "You are going to be very annoying to take care of." I said, "I don't need taking care of." She said, "You are on the floor." I said, "I'm assessing the situation." She said, "From the floor." She got me up. She is strong, Nina, stronger than she looks, and she looks strong, and she got my arm over her shoulders and walked me those 9 feet to the bed, which felt considerably longer and got me horizontal. She took my boots off, which I could not have done myself right then, and I had the sense not to comment on that. She went away and came back with a cloth that was either cool or I was hot enough that everything was cool by comparison, and she laid it on my forehead. She said something else in Apache, quietly, and then she went away and I heard sounds from the kitchen for a while. I woke in the night and she was in the chair beside the bed, not asleep, sitting in the dark with her hands in her lap, completely still, not doing anything. "Nina," I said. "You're awake. What time is it?" "Late, go back to sleep." "You don't have to stay." "I know," she said. I didn't argue. I was too diminished to argue, and honestly I didn't want to. There is a thing that happens when a man is truly sick, truly down. It takes everything with it. All the management, all the arrangements we put between ourselves and other people so they don't see too much. I had nothing arranged. I was just a man in a bed in the dark, and there was a woman in the chair beside me who had chosen to be there, and I had not had that since my mother died. Just someone in the dark beside me, by choice. "Tell me something," I said. "A story, I don't care what." She was quiet for a moment. Then she started talking, low and even, and she told me about this land, not its history, but its character, where the water moved underground and how you could find it. What the desert did in early spring, the 2 weeks before it turned hot, when things bloomed that only bloomed then. What each of those plants could do. "How do you know all this?" I said. "I grew up not far from here," she said. "Before." Before, I didn't ask about before. She'd offered as much of that as she wanted to offer. "2 of those plants," she said, "have already been in what I gave you today." "What did you give me?" I said. "You were better by morning," she said. "Sleep, Cal." My name, said plainly like a fact. The way my mother used to say it, just Cal, like I was something real and she was glad of it. I slept. I was down 4 days. 4 days, and the ranch did not wait. The animals needed feeding and watering. The ice needed breaking every morning. The wood needed bringing in. A dozen things. Nina did all of it. I know because when I was up and moving on the 5th day, everything was in order, better order than I usually kept, and I noted that with a feeling that was partly sting and partly not sting at all, depending on how I looked at it. When I was upright, she put a bowl of something in front of me and told me to eat all of it. I said, "What is this?" She said, "Food." I said, "I can see that." She said, "Then eat it." I ate it, every bit of it. It was good. She sat across the table and watched me eat with an expression that was mostly neutral but had something underneath it, some assessment running alongside the neutral surface. The bill of sale reading, but different from how it had been in November. Softer, maybe, like the numbers had come back right enough times that she was starting to let herself believe them. When I finished, she took the bowl to the basin and came back and sat down, and we had coffee, and I said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I watched you do all of it this week," I said, "from bed when I could see the yard, and I know you did what I couldn't see, the animals, the ice, everything." I looked at her across the table. I don't know how to say what I want to say without it coming out wrong. "Say it anyway," she said. "My father worked this land for 30 years, I said, "and my mother worked it alongside him. And when she died, the work didn't change. There was still the same amount of it, but something else changed, some quality of the days. He used to say the work was lighter when she was here, and I thought he meant she helped with it, but I don't think that's what he meant." I looked at my coffee. "I think he meant something more than that." She looked at me across the table. "Yes," she said, "I know what he meant." She put her hand on the table, on the crack, not on my hand, just near it on the wood, the warmth of it a real and particular thing. "I've been watching you," she said, "since November, the way you work this place, the way you talk about the table, this land, the way you went up on that barn roof even though it bothered you and did it without making anything of it. The way you stood in that doorway when that man came." She was quiet a moment. Where I come from, a man who does what needs doing without talking about it, that's not a small thing. That's worth something." She said it plainly, not performing anything, just stating what she'd concluded, looking straight at me. "And the way you spent the last money you had," she said, $20 in November. "I've thought about that a lot. What kind of man does something like that?" I said, "I don't know what kind of man it makes me." She said, "I do." Outside, the January night pressed against the window, and the stove threw its heat, and the cottonwoods along the creek were bare and still. And across the table, my father had built a woman who had been standing straight on a crate in Dellard 2 months ago, was looking at me like the numbers had come back right. "I'm not going to Bisbee alone in spring," she said. "I want you to know that now." I looked at her. "You'd stay," I said. "With conditions," she said. "We go to Bisbee together, we see my sister, and then we come back." "That's not a condition," I said. "That's a plan." Something changed in her face. Not a smile, more like the thing underneath a smile, the thing that makes a smile mean something. "Cal," she said, "that's how I know." I turned my hand over on the wood, and she put hers in mine, and we sat like that at my father's table with the stove going and the winter dark at the window, and the next season was somewhere out there ahead of us, waiting to be worked. February passed. March came in slow and tentative, the way March does here, not all at once but in hints, a warmth in the midday sun, the smell of the ground starting to change. The man from Dellard came back in the last week of February, which Nina had predicted. He brought 2 men with him this time, came in the daylight, which read as either confidence or miscalculation. He stopped at my gate and called out, and I went to the porch and Nina came and stood beside me. I had my rifle. She had the axe handle from the woodpile. We stood on the porch in the cold morning, the 2 of us, and looked at him and his 2 men. His men looked at us. They looked at each other. I said, "Nothing here is for sale." He looked at Nina standing at my side. He looked at the axe handle. He looked at my face. He turned his horse and rode out. His men followed. Nina watched them go until the road was empty. Then she leaned the axe handle against the porch post and went inside. I stood there a minute longer. 32 years on this land. Every season of it, every bad year, both parents buried from it. I had never felt more like it was mine than in that moment, standing on the porch with a woman who had chosen to stand there. Not a woman I had saved, a woman who had made a choice about where to stand. That distinction mattered more to me than I had language for at the time. What she was doing by standing there, by choosing to stand there, that was the gift. That was what made it mean something. A man can protect and provide and stand in doorways all his life, and none of it has any particular weight until someone who didn't have to chooses to stand beside him anyway. We went to Bisbee in late March, after the worst of it was done. I borrowed Harlan Pruitt's wagon and we drove south and west on roads that were rough in places, Nina navigating by things I couldn't see, some interior map older and more detailed than anything a white man had drawn of this country. The journey took 2 days. I didn't find it long. We camped the first night in a dry wash that Nina picked without hesitation, a spot sheltered from the wind where the ground was level, and the rock behind us held the heat from the fire. She made coffee on the road the same way she made it at the ranch, strong, no ceremony about it, just done right. And we sat by the fire and watched the night come in from the east with all its stars, and she told me the Apache names for some of them, and I told her the names my grandfather had used, the Spanish names from Sonora. And we found a few that matched up and a few that didn't and had a conversation about what it means that different people looked at the same sky and named what they saw differently. She said, "It means the sky is big enough for more than one story." I said, "That seems right." The fire went down and we slept. Her sister's house was near the mine in Bisbee, a small adobe with a kitchen garden put to bed for winter, but showing clear evidence of serious intention. Delgadina came out before we'd fully stopped, and she and Nina were together before I'd set the brake, and I found things to do with the horse for a while. Delgadina was older than Nina by some years and had the same cheekbones, the same black eyes, the same quality of measuring everything before speaking. That first evening she asked me careful questions, the kind a woman asks when she has one sister and wants to be sure. I answered them honestly and completely, including the parts that weren't flattering. She listened to everything, asked 2 follow-up questions I hadn't expected, and then moved on to dinner. On the second day, Nina and her sister went somewhere together for several hours. I walked the town, looked at the mine workings, bought some hardware we needed, came back and sat on the front step. When they returned, Delgadina looked at me differently, not with warmth exactly, but with the settled look of a woman who has gotten the answer she was looking for and has decided what to do with it. On the third morning, Nina came out with her bag and put it in the wagon. She and her sister stood together quietly for a while. When Nina walked to the wagon, I looked up and Delgadina was in the doorway watching me, and she nodded once. Deliberate, considered. I nodded back. We were an hour out of Bisbee when Nina said, "She gave us her blessing." I said, "I figured." She said, "You have an honest face." "High praise," I said. She also said, "You drive like someone who learned on flat ground." I said, "That is entirely fair." Nina made a sound, not quite a laugh but in the same country as one. I was keeping a catalog of these sounds. I intended to collect more of them over a long time. "Cal," she said. "Yeah." She asked me if I was sure. The wagon wheel found a stone and I steadied us. "What did you tell her?" She was quiet a moment. The desert was coming awake around us, the way it does in spring, sudden and committed, like it had been planning this all winter. Things blooming that hadn't been visible a month before. The scrub going from dead brown to green, the low flowers appearing from nothing in the sandy ground. "I told her I was sure," Nina said. "I didn't say anything. Some things you let stand." We drove north. We drove back toward the 412 acres and the cracked pine table and the fixed barn roof and the mule and the stove and the cottonwoods along the dry creek that would have new leaves on them now, the first small ones. After a while, Nina put her hand on my arm, just rested it there, looking at the country going by. "It's different," she said, "going toward something." I thought about that. "From going away from something," she said. "The direction matters." "We're going home," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "we are." Summer came and the irrigation line held. The 60 acres turned and went in and came up. Not a record crop. The land wasn't that kind, and I hadn't been farming for records, but enough. Enough to cover the winter and put something by, which was more than I'd been able to save for 3 years running. By midsummer, Dellard had reached its own conclusions about Cal Ray's and the woman helping him at the ranch. The conclusions ranged from the generous to otherwise, and I heard some of what was said and ignored most of it. The people whose opinions mattered were Pete Sandoval, who came for supper in June, and was easy about it in the way people from old families in this territory tend to be, and his wife, who talked to Nina in the kitchen for an hour and came out looking satisfied about something. And Mitch Albright, who gave Nina a weighing look when she came in with me one afternoon, and then extended her the same credit terms he extended me, which in Mitch Albright's vocabulary was a significant statement, and I told him so later. The territorial assessor came in August, new to the territory, with the manner of a man still sorting out what he was looking at. He walked the property and saw the barn roof and the straight fence line and the turned fields and the functioning irrigation and Nina in the kitchen garden she'd put in along the south wall of the house, which by August was producing more than the 2 of us could eat alone. He wrote in his ledger. He quoted me a tax number that was lower than the previous year. He said the improvements outweighed the adjustment in valuation, and said it the dry way assessors do, not looking up from his ledger. "I paid the tax." That night we had coffee, and I told Nina about the assessment. She looked at her cup for a moment and then at me. "This place," she said quietly, like she was speaking to the table or to herself or to both of us at once. "It wants to grow." "It does," I said. She put her hand on the table, on the crack, the one my mother had filled with candle wax because the table had dried and split, and my father had looked at it, and my mother had said it's a conversation piece, and my father had said the conversation's short and they'd both laughed, and I'd been 8 years old and thought that laughter was the whole world. "Tell me about your mother again," Nina said. So I told her, the table and the candle wax and the conversation piece and what my mother's laugh had sounded like in this room. Nina listened the way she listened to everything, fully, without interrupting or looking away, taking it in and keeping it somewhere. When I finished, she was quiet a moment. "She sounds like a woman who knew what was worth keeping," she said. I looked at her across my father's table. "Yes," I said, "she was. I want to say one more thing about Cutter, because he deserves it. Harlan Prout worked him one spring and then sold him to a man named Darrow with a spread east of Dellard. And Darrow was a decent man who treated animals decently. And the last I heard, Cutter was getting on in years but was still sound, which is all you can ask. I saw him once from a distance, on the road, that big sorrel head and the patient way of moving, and if he saw me he didn't show it. Horses have a way of moving on that I've always thought was more dignified than most of what people manage. I sold him in November because I had $20 and no other way to continue, and then I spent the $20. I've been asked over the years whether I regret it, usually by men who ask it as a jab, expecting it to sting. What I've come to understand is that regret lives mostly in the distance between what you chose and what would have been safe. When you make the right choice, it doesn't leave much room for regret, even when it was expensive, even when it was the last thing you had. What I got for $20 was a woman who found the second crack in my irrigation line by listening to the ground. A woman who fixed a barn roof beside me without making it a performance. A woman who sat in the dark in January and told me about spring flowers so I could sleep. A woman who stood on my porch with an axe handle when it was needed and then leaned it against the post and went inside like it was nothing. A woman who looked at me across a cracked pine table and said I was worth something, in the plain voice of someone who doesn't say things unless they've earned them. What I got for $20 was not a saved woman. What I got was the woman who saved me. Not from anything dramatic, not from a burning building or a flood or a gun pointed at me, from the quieter thing, the particular kind of ruin that comes for a man in increments over years, when he's been alone long enough that he starts to believe the aloneness is just his shape. When the money is gone and the horse is gone and the accounts don't come out right, and there's nothing at the table but him and the crack in the pine and the memory of when the table was full. That kind of ruin. The kind that happens so gradually, and you're too busy doing what needs doing to sit with how much has gone. She saw me. That's what it was. She read the bill of sale across that table in January and the numbers came back right, and she said so plainly, without decoration. And a man who'd spent 32 years being careful and solitary and largely unnoticed sat there and believed her. Not because she said it sweetly, because she said it like it was a simple fact, the same way she said everything, and she didn't say things unless they were. That's the whole thing. That's what $20 bought. Outside it's early evening now, the kind this country does when the sun gets low, light going sideways, everything it touches turning a color somewhere between gold and dust and something older than both. The kitchen garden Nina put in along the south wall is still going, the late summer things that run into September. She's out there now. I can see her from where I'm sitting, moving slow along the row, checking something, her hands knowing what they're looking for before her eyes find it. The cottonwoods along the dry creek have gone full summer, thick with leaves, loud in any wind. The barn is solid. The irrigation is running. The 60 acres are in and coming along better than last year. The lamp isn't lit yet. I'll light it when the sun gets all the way down. Nina will come in when she's done, and she'll wash her hands at the basin and she'll say something about one of the plants, or the weather, or something she's been turning over in her mind, and I'll answer, and we'll have supper at my father's table, the one with the crack and the candle wax and the short conversation that made my parents laugh. And maybe she'll ask me something I haven't told her yet, something from the long years before November 1887, and I'll tell it. Or maybe she'll tell me something from before, from the parts she hasn't offered yet. We're still trading those. Still learning the full inventory of each other slowly, the way you walk the whole length of a piece of land until you know every corner. That's its own thing, that, learning a person over time. I had forgotten what it was like, or maybe I'd never fully known it. My parents had each other, and I'd watched that from the outside, the shorthand of two people who know each other's silences as well as their words. I understand now what I was watching. You can watch a thing for 30 years and not understand it until you're inside it yourself. And I'll put my hand on the wood, and she'll put hers next to it, and the lamp will burn. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's the most a man can ask for, and I know better than most what it's worth, and what it costs, and why the cost doesn't register as a cost at all when you're sitting here with the lamp on and the evening coming down, and a good woman moving through the last of the light outside your window. $20. The last thing I had, worth every cent, and then everything that doesn't have a price at all. The lamp will burn. That's all.